Okay, thank you for coming and welcome to Philippe. Just a brief summary of the book. It's structured around a memo, a famous memo called the Action Memo, where Rumsfeld, which is signed by Rumsfeld, which is the moment at which extreme interrogation methods become legitimate or deemed as legitimate within the war on terror. And the whole book is really a forensic analysis tracing the process by which all the rules, all the laws, all the principles that had governed interrogation methods until that time were just jettisoned. So, again, the structure is trying to identify the members of the team, the lawyers, who, having been schooled in the principles of law and the principles of justice, allowed themselves to be sucked in to the rhetoric and the reasoning which made it possible to go from principles which did not allow extreme torture methods to be used, that permitted them. So I've read the book and I've followed the forensic, detailed analysis of this, but Philippe, who wrote it and researched it exhaustively, I mean, perhaps you can start by telling us who were the members of this team, and how were they selected, and how were they recruited, and how did they become part of this thing?
Sure. Well, it's very nice to be here, Lenka, and I'm delighted that lots of people are so interested in how torture began that they would take an evening off to come and listen to it. I mean, this book is different from anything else that I've written. It's the story of a single piece of paper. And perhaps it's more my barrister's role than an academic role. I wear two hats. That when I saw this piece of paper for the first time, in June 2004, when it was released by the Bush administration to try to send out, rather perversely, an explanation in response to the pictures of Abu Ghraib that they did not do abusive things and that the pictures of Abu Ghraib were unconnected to administration policies. I took this piece of paper and looked at it, read it, reread it, read it again, and was struck by a number of things in this single A4 sheet of paper that were peculiar. It came also with a number of attachments, which we'll no doubt talk about a bit more, but the attachments traced back a series of documents all the way back to Guantanamo and suggested that the source of the interrogation techniques was the combatant commander at Guantanamo, a man called Michael Dunleavy, a reserve intelligence officer who also happened to be a judge. That was his request for these new techniques. And then there was the sign-off by his legal advisor, staff judge advocate, Lieutenant Colonel Diane Beaver, a sort of 8-page single-space memo. And there were a couple of other documents tracing it all the way up to Rumsfeld's office. And a number of things struck me, but what struck me most was that I couldn't understand how it was that lawyers had signed off on these techniques of interrogation, which on their face were inconsistent with all the rules that the United States had done so much to put in place. And what I decided to do was, rather than just write some sort of dense academic book, I would go and find everyone. I'd go and speak to everybody who was involved. I didn't know anybody. I was in London, they were all in the States. I had no connection to any of them to begin with. I sort of ferreted around and found connections. And I decided that I would try to hear from each person involved in the decision-making process what their story was and try to recreate what had actually happened rather than what the administration was saying had happened. What the administration was saying had happened was that this had come from the ground, it had come from the Guantanamo people, it had been initiated by the military, and the administration had simply done what a sound, decent administration would do, approve what the military wanted. And the most important thing, in fact, which Lenka didn't mention, is this wasn't the techniques of interrogation authorized by the CIA, or for the CIA. This was the techniques authorized for use by the military. And the US military does not do abusive interrogation. Whatever popular culture tells us, they have a very long and distinguished history, going back to the 1860s, of respecting detainees, and to the extent that there have been violations of those rules, they've never been formalized, they've never been institutionalized. So there's been abuses in Vietnam and in Central America and other places, but you won't find another piece of paper like this piece of paper. So the book is the story, such as I was able to find it, of this piece of paper.
The impression was given, or they tried to give the impression, that the new rules on interrogation were asked for by the people managing Guantanamo. But there's quite a lot in your book that suggests that that was stage managed, that that wasn't really the case.
Well, there were a lot of clues. I mean, imagine yourself back to the spring, summer of 2004, and we all can vaguely remember when the pictures of Abu Ghraib began to emerge, and we were all pretty shocked about those pictures. And the administration had a big problem on its hands, a really big problem. I mean, it has been, I think, catastrophic, but I think the administration recognized that this was potentially going to be even more catastrophic than it has been. And so they needed to come up with some narrative that would allow them to say what happened at Abu Ghraib had nothing to do with administration policies. What happened at Abu Ghraib was a few bad eggs down on the ground at Guantanamo. Now, in the period when the Abu Ghraib story emerged on a CBS program, 60 Minutes, which many of you will know, for the first time pictures were broadcast. They had been held back for about 3 months. The pictures had been made available inside the Pentagon, we now know, as early as January. And for 3 months, the administration sat on journalists and said, please, please, please do not print this stuff. Came out on the 28th of April 2004, CBS 60 Minutes. And around the time that came out, there was also a series of rumors that began that the Department of Justice, which is the sort of principal legal organ of US government, had authorized aggressive techniques of interrogation. And rumors began to emerge about a memo that started to be referred to as a torture memo, which had redefined torture. And the administration came under intense pressure. And along with the document that I've written about, they also released on the same day, on the 22nd of June 2004, another document, which was signed by the head of the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice, a man called Ghraib, another lawyer, a man who now happens to be a federal judge in San Francisco, amazingly. And it was a 50-page or so memorandum which ditched definitions of torture in American law, ditched definitions of torture in international law, the US had led the world in putting in place, and replaced it with a new definition of torture. Basically, it's only torture if the pain reaches a point at which it is equivalent to that felt upon organ failure or death. So they've, completely redefined torture and created a threshold, which means that everything that's below that is permitted. But they said that memo had nothing to do with actual policies. That memo was stargazing, just, it's the role of the lawyers to look at what the different arguments are and to give us their advice. We didn't rely on that. And so they made it very clear that that memo, the memo written by Ghraib and John Yoo, now an academic at Berkeley Law School, where I've been invited to go and visit Berkeley in November, which will be very interesting.
Be debating with him, will you?
Yeah, absolutely. No, he won't. A lot of these people now won't be in the same room as me. So, but they said this memo had nothing to do with actual policies. And so this was the second thing that I thought was curious, because I already knew by then that John Yoo, the academic, was very friendly with the man who had written the action memo for Mr. Rumsfeld, who was Mr. Rumsfeld's lawyer. It was written by a man called Jim Haynes, who was the general counsel of the Department of Defense, Harvard Law School trained, serious lawyer. And he would play squash with John Yoo, and all of a sudden you began to put things together. Could Jim Haynes have known about John Yu's memorandum when he wrote his memorandum for Rumsfeld. And so part of my task, I suppose, was to, and I went at it with a pretty open mind, as we talked, to join up all the dots and actually to work out what had happened and how all these people had connected and what had really happened.
But so what is your conclusion? Was it just a coincidence of opinions that genuinely felt that in the face of a terrible danger that changing the rules was a necessity, or was it a conspiracy to divert the governing authorities from well-established practices to a new political agenda, to a new justice agenda?
No, the pressure, what I discovered was that the pressure came from the very top. So the administration's narrative, this was a bottom-up thing, it trickled up from the bottom, which intuitively many people, myself included, were suspicious about, was a nonsense. What happened was that very early on after September the 11th, a matter of hours, days, a decision was taken to move to a new paradigm in the context of the so-called war on terror. In February 2002, they decided that in November 2001, they decided they would create a new facility that was outside the territory of the United States in order to remove themselves from the scope of application of US federal law. 3 months later, in February, that was Guantanamo. 3 months later, in February 2002, the president decreed that none of the detainees at Guantanamo would have any rights under the Geneva Convention. 3 months after that, they discovered at Guantanamo a man by the name of Mohammed al-Qahtani, detainee 063, thought to be the 20th hijacker. And the normal techniques of interrogation used by the FBI down at Guantanamo, used by the military, had produced nothing. And the regular account that I got from people was, for the people down at Guantanamo, look, you've got to understand, we were getting intelligence that the threats to America were spiking, there was going to be another attack on the anniversary of 9/11, we were under tremendous pressure to get more information, plus there was pressure from the Pentagon to move to new techniques of interrogation. And so what I uncovered, or, perhaps uncovered is too strong, I think a lot of people had an instinct that that's what happened, was that the push for new techniques of interrogation did not come from the ground, came from the Pentagon, came from the Vice President's office, came from the Secretary of Defense's office, included the involvement of the President's counsel, Alberto Gonzales, who went on to be the Attorney General. Lots of names, and I apologize for that. You'll begin to see who all the names are as the picture emerges. But in a sense, if there was a sort of critical defining moment, it was in the course of my conversation with Diane Beaver, the lawyer down at Guantanamo, when I learnt that the most senior lawyers in the administration had been down to Guantanamo in September 2002. In other words, 2 or 3 weeks before the request for new interrogation techniques is said to have come up from Guantanamo, the President's lawyer, Vice President's lawyer, David Addington, Secretary of Defense's lawyer, Jim Haynes, have flown down together to meet with the interrogators, to watch an interrogation, to meet the combatant commander Dunleavy, to meet the lawyer, and basically left them with the message, do whatever needs to be done. And that explodes the story that the administration has spun.
With a certain degree of deniability. Just do whatever needs to be done, we don't really want to know the details.
There's no apparent paper trail. The paper trail points in a different direction, do what needs to be done. And at this point, of course, just to backtrack a little bit, I'd written another book 3 years earlier, which didn't meet all the people who had been involved in this. A book called Lawless World, which some of you will know because it was the book that told the story of the circumstances in which the British Attorney General changed his advice on the legality of the war in Iraq. And that book had 1 chapter on Guantanamo, and I'd written about the story, but from a greater distance. I'd not met any of the people, and I was less than complimentary about Diane Beaver's legal advice. It's ghastly legal advice. I thought it was ghastly then, I think it's ghastly now, but I hadn't met Beaver. And now I've spent a lot of time with Diane Beaver, and I began to understand the circumstances in which she found herself. And we were talking about this before, I developed, I wouldn't say a sympathy for her, but a recognition that she found herself in an absolutely impossible situation. It's very easy for people like me to come down like a ton of bricks on the lawyer who happens to be down at Guantanamo, who's basically fingered and scapegoated by the administration as the person who started all of this in some way, and not know the circumstances in which she found herself. Imagine an individual who's got no background in this area of law, has not done any work on the Geneva Conventions, has not advised on interrogations, has been plucked from a torts claims office in the Pentagon and sent down to Guantanamo. Al-Qahtani's discovered, she happens to be the lawyer down there, her combatant commander tells her to sign off on it verbally. She refuses, as she tells me, and she insists on putting it in writing, her opinion, in the hope that as it goes up the food chain, someone who actually knows something about this area of law will step in and say, hang on a second, this is outrageous, the American military doesn't do this, and that never happened, and we'll come on to why that never happened. But I came to understand that what had gone wrong was that the system had allowed her to be put in that position.
Well, but that went right for them, isn't it? I mean, you say it went wrong. I mean, just to fill the audience in if they haven't read the book, this is a woman who had reached the glass ceiling in a man's world in the army. She thought she was all washed up. Nothing was happening for her. She gets the call to go to Guantanamo. There is a legal vacuum because the Geneva Convention, according to the president, no longer doesn't apply to the prisoners in Guantanamo. And she accepts this as though he's the Pope. She says, I'm not going to second-guess the president.
But would you do anything differently?
Well, I think as a lawyer, you know that the Pope, that the president isn't the Pope,
but
and he isn't above the law.
Let's just test this. You're a military lawyer.
No, I mean,
insubordination. Your president, commander-in-chief, decrees that Geneva doesn't apply at Guantanamo. You're some junior lawyer who's been parachuted in. Your commander-in-chief basically tells you Geneva doesn't apply.
This is your big chance to sort of do something interesting.
She said to me, it's insubordination. For me to have raised the question of the validity of the president's decision is insubordination, instant court-martial, instant firing. Now,
well,
that doesn't mean she shouldn't have done it.
But as a lawyer, in that situation, if she's accepted that that's insubordination, she's not going to second-guess the president. She's got this amazingly difficult job, which is there are no rules about whether or not you torture prisoners to save your country, because there is another attack imminent, apparently. So she's got this completely blank sheet, and she's got to make up these new rules. So she brainstorms all these people, and they all give her their ideas, people who've been involved one way or another, and she still doesn't know what to do. And so she emails all her friends and all her contacts in the legal world, and there's a sort of resounding silence in response, and none of her contacts and none of her colleagues want to say anything. Everybody's distancing themselves. She's totally on her own. And so my question has to be, did they choose her because they felt that she would be malleable, that she would be easy to manage, that she would be biddable?
They chose her boss because he would do what Mr. Rumsfeld wanted.
So the
her boss is a very powerful individual. I spent quite a few hours with him. He's the judge, Dunleavy, very senior to her, in a sort of legal pecking order, male, female, dynamic, very difficult for her in those circumstances. So what does she do? You know, I mean, I've cut her a lot of slack, I accept that. I've been criticized for, in a sense, letting her off the hook. But I've done it knowingly, because I don't think she is the responsible person. The system...
No, she's the fall guy. She was made the fall guy, wasn't she?
She's the fall guy, or she's one of the fall people. And she has been severely criticized by other military lawyers for not having stopped it and said no.
She was one of many, right? She wasn't the only one.
She was the most junior one. But it was, I think, reasonable in her position to expect that as the memos made their way up, they would reach a point at which the senior military lawyers would get involved. That was what she told me was her expectation. it never happened. In fact, what's happened since the book came out is there have been a whole series of hearings on the story in the book before the House Judiciary Committee. I've flown over 3 times, I've testified before the House, I've testified before the Senate, and she has been hauled up. People have been subpoenaed to appear against their will. And what emerges from the hearings, which I allude to in the book, I have some of it in the book, but I didn't have the full amount, was that as it made its way up the chain of command, eventually it reaches the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Okay, so pause again. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Richard Myers, most powerful military man in the world. It gets to his desk. And he thinks, well, I met with him, I describe in the book my sort of slightly surreal meeting with him in Washington. And he says, well, radioactive, pass it to Jane, my lawyer. Jane, we now know, begins the process of a wide review. Her reaction to it is, whoa, US military doesn't do this sort of stuff. So she puts it out to a broader review by the senior military lawyers that Beaver hasn't yet reached. What happens then? Myers, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, tells her, I've just been contacted by Mr. Rumsfeld's lawyer, Mr. Haynes, stop the review. Dalton tells Congress that by this point, some of the military lawyers at a much more senior level have come in and said, stop, we can't do this. The review process was stopped. Haynes short-circuited the decision-making process, and it went straight to Rumsfeld, where it was approved. Now, in circumstances in which, if things had followed a normal decision-making process, those lawyers would have cut in, they would have overridden Diane Beaver's legal advice. It seems to me it's hard to point the finger of blame at her. It's very easy for us to say, well, if we'd have been down there, you know, we'd have done it differently. And, you know, I've been a junior lawyer. I know what it's like when you are at the bottom of the food chain and a big, powerful man like Jim Haynes comes down to visit and says, this is what we need to do. I don't blame her.
But that's not what I'm asking. I mean, I think it's obvious that she was the fall guy. She was used. The question is whether she was picked out specifically because she was somebody who would be usable, you know, and who was pulling those strings and who was in charge, you know, whether that was a cynical attempt to just use her to make that thing happen.
I actually didn't get the impression that she had been selected because of her malleability. It may have been that they decided that they didn't want someone who actually had any background in this area of law.
She had no knowledge of international law.
Perfect. But I didn't pick up, no one said to me, oh yeah, we went for Diane because we knew she'd be a pushover. Actually, the thing about Diane Beaver is she still rather thinks she did the right thing. She rather believes that in the face of the threat faced by the United States, it was appropriate to consider going down this route. And I disagree with her fundamentally on that. But she's got no background in this area.
You say in the book, it may or may not have made America a safer place, which suggests that...
That's the barristerial...
Okay, that's just a piece of rhetoric, is it? Okay, because that's, of course, the major argument. I mean, whether you're talking to Americans, whether you're talking to our intelligence committees in Britain, they will all tell you that major attacks, they can't tell you what, have been avoided by the uses of these new techniques, and that we're all safer in our beds because of it. Right. And you're acknowledging that that may be true.
I'm confirming that it's not true.
Okay.
Just to be absolutely clear. I mean, again, you know, we're all in the same position, all of us in this room. We hear our leaders sort of say, oh yes, we need to do this, and oh yes, it's fantastically difficult, and we know lots of things you don't know. So what I thought I'd do is I'd home in on one story, the interrogation of one man, and find out what happened. So another person that I went to see was the head of what was called Al-Qahtani's exploitation team. The man who was charged in the Defense Intelligence Agency with assessing the information that came from Al-Qahtani's abusive interrogation. His interrogation, should be said, lasted 54 days. Can
I just interject 1 second? One of the reasons historically that the Americans have not used torture is because they took the view that it was not productive, it didn't give you good information, and that the best way to get good information was to have a rapport with people. And the rule book said you don't torture people because it doesn't work. So assessing the outcome of al-Qahtani's interrogation under torture was rather crucial in seeing whether this new idea was more productive than had gone before.
The administration said making him stand endlessly, 20-hour continuous interrogations, no proper sleep, forced nudity, forced grooming, dehydration, extremes, real extremes of heat and cold,
humiliation,
the use of dogs, sexual humiliation, over a 54-day period. The administration's narrative is that produced useful information. Well, I got it straight from the person who oversaw the product, so to speak, of that interrogation. It produced nothing. And so I conclude clearly in relation to that story, it didn't produce anything, and I'm completely skeptical that the interrogation of anybody has produced anything meaningful, largely because the experienced interrogators you speak to will tell you that the only thing that works is rapport building over an extended period of time, and that abusing people produces information, but it doesn't produce reliable information. Basically, it produces what the person who is abused thinks you want to hear.
And yet, for the American public, the fact that there has been no 9/11 since the original one, the fact that there's been no terrorist attack, will be evidence that in some way the authorities have been vindicated. And the fact that Obama has not gone large on the events at Guantanamo suggests to me that he doesn't think that's going to play well with the wider American public. The wider American public isn't so concerned about human rights being observed in a place like Guantanamo when they still feel the danger to be so enormous.
I mean, in a sense, that's right. I mean, I think the Democrats have calculated that the national security issue, which is the flip side of the abuse, is one that they don't want to upset by going too strong on this. But Obama has made some very powerful speeches about torture, has made some very powerful speeches about Guantanamo. Joe Biden, 10 days ago, perhaps accidentally, said, yes, once we're in office, we'll have to look at prosecuting some of these senior officials. And that is firmly on the agenda. I think many Americans recognize that, sure, there have been no attacks within the United States, but look at what's happening to US interests around the world. Look at how many Americans have died outside of the United States, and it becomes a much more complex equation. And in particular, applying an analysis or an assessment of what the British experience was, because we used techniques of interrogation that were rather similar. They were called the 5 techniques: hooding, stress positions, nudity, dogs. We used them for a very short period in 1971 in relation to the IRA. And they were stopped very, very soon because, firstly, they weren't seen to be producing particularly useful information. They were undermining morale of the people who were engaged in these practices. But most significantly, they were creating a fantastic recruitment tool. The techniques were used by people who were being abused to recruit others who were on the fence. When I went to talk about this book in Belfast, it was very interesting. A woman at the back of the room put her hand up and said, I was interned in 1971. I wasn't subject to the 5 techniques, but lots of my colleagues were, lots of my friends were, and it was the best recruitment tool we could have had. And so when the Brits went to the US after 9/11, this is recounted in Jane Mayer's book, The Dark Side, the Brits basically said to the Americans, don't go down the route of abuse. It will backfire. It will extend the conflict. It will make things worse. And that's what has happened. And I think there's some evidence that the combination of abusive techniques of interrogation against the IRA and internment and Bloody Sunday extended the conflict with the IRA by between 10 and 15 years. So, I come out of this pretty clear.
You're confident
it's not a useful thing to do. It has been terribly damaging. And of course, as we'll see, it migrated. These are the very techniques that migrated to Abu Ghraib.
And later, I mean, how much of the British principles were changed as a result? Was there not a trickle down and a filter through to the way the British?
It was very curious. It was very, very curious.
In Basra?
I'm a barrister at Matrix Chambers, and one of my colleagues was instructed, some of you will remember the case of Colonel Mendonca in Basra, who was accused of abusing Iraqi detainees in Basra. And so tracing back the story, what had begun in the Pentagon had ended up, you know, in the barrister who's in the room next to me's office, in my own barrister's chambers. It was very weird. So what happened was, after the abuse of Al-Qahtani was stopped in mid-January 2003 by a very, very brave lawyer, and I think one thing that is very important to leave you with a clear sense of is the support for these abusive techniques of interrogation was confined to a very small group. So the State Department was cut out of the decision-making process. The senior military lawyers who knew about it opposed it, and those who did not know about it were obviously cut out of the process. But about 2 or 3 weeks into Al-Qahtani's interrogation, those down at Guantanamo who were strongly opposed to this being done found a lawyer in the Pentagon who took up the case, an extraordinary individual by the name of Alberto Mora, who was the General Counsel of the Navy, one of Haynes's deputies, who confronted Haynes directly with all of this and brought this to an end. But what happened after it had ended at Guantanamo was that it migrated 7 months later to Abu Ghraib. Mike Dunleavy had by then been replaced at Guantanamo. He was replaced by a man called Major General Geoffrey Miller. Geoffrey Miller went to Iraq. By now the war had started in Iraq. And he visited Baghdad and Abu Ghraib, accompanied by the same Diane Beaver, in August 2003. They met with the combatant commander for Iraq, Major General Sanchez. And Sanchez promulgated new techniques of interrogation on the 14th of September 2003, hooding, stress positions, dogs, nudity, all the same stuff that was in the techniques that had come, if you like, from Guantanamo. The techniques then migrated in a way that has not yet clearly been established from Baghdad down to the British at Basra, and on the 15th of September, the abuse started at Basra. I mean, the timing is either extraordinarily coincidental or directly connected. But in the course of Colonel Mendonca's court-martial proceedings, it turned out that he'd been given advice by a British lawyer to say, actually, these techniques are okay. And when that was traced, it hasn't fully been investigated. It turned out that that lawyer had been in contact with the American lawyers in Baghdad, and you can begin to see how the migration
is systemic.
And you know, there were some amazing people that I met who'd been down at Guantanamo. There was a great clinical psychologist who worked for an entity called the Naval Criminal Investigation Service. He was a guy from the Bronx by the name of Mike Gillis. I have a whole chapter about him. I was really struck by this guy. And he had been down at Guantanamo while all this was going on, fighting the fight to stop this from happening. And his task was made impossible by things like the television program 24, which was being beamed into Guantanamo and communicating the message, torture works, it produces useful information, let's go for it. He was coming up with arguments from Alan Dershowitz at Harvard Law School saying, let's institutionalize torture if it's going to happen anyway, not because Dershowitz supports torture, he says he doesn't, but if it's going to happen, let's make it transparent, let's make it accountable.
Regulatable.
Let's make it sort of institutionalized in that way. And it was Gillis who basically tracked down with a couple of his colleagues Alberto Mora. But he described to me how, from a clinical psychologist's point of view, you don't go down this route at all. You don't open the door. Why not? And he has these wonderful little turns of phrase. You know, once you let the dogs off the leash, you can't put the leash back on. Once you tell a soldier that a little bit of abuse is a good thing, the soldier's going to conclude that a bit more abuse is an even better thing. And so for people like Gillis and Mora, the door had to be kept absolutely shut. Once you opened that door at all, you could no longer control what would happen. And that is why I've concluded, and the Inspector General of the Department of Defense has concluded that these techniques, which were closely related to a parallel set of techniques that were approved by the CIA, for use by the CIA a little earlier in the summer of 2002, were indeed the source of the pictures that later emerged from Abu Ghraib.
There are two things I want to ask you. We're going to run out of time because people are going to want to ask questions. One very interesting aspect of your book is all this is going on in private, secret memos between a very small group of people who are being recruited to enforce a new policy. But in the public domain, there's a whole other thing going on, which is this debate with Dershowitz, who is debating with people on television how you legitimize torture. If you're going to try and get information which is going to save your country, save the world from a terrible disaster, how do you organize that? How do you make it legal? How do you control it? And then this drama, 24, which my children watched, which everybody watched, was very gripping, which was brilliantly directed and produced, which had Kiefer Sutherland as, again, you know, the CIA man, the savior of civilization as we know it, torturing people. And did that, obviously your view is that played very heavily into the public domain, but was that in some way a sinister plot to get that out there, or was it coincidental?
That I don't know. I mean, people have now started writing about this, and in fact the American military has made a démarche to the makers of 24 to say, hey guys, you know, you ought to know what consequences this might be having. But that happened, in fact, before my book had come out. I came across the 24 thing completely accidentally. I hadn't watched 24. I didn't know what 24 was. I'm in one of my early interviews with Diane Beaver, and she won't let me record the interview, so I'm taking notes. And she describes to me the influences and these people coming down. They didn't know who they were, and then there was this thing, 24 and Becker, and so I write down 24 Becker.
You never watched it?
I didn't know what it was. So I go back to my hotel room, type out my notes before I've forgotten what she's told me, before, you know, I've forgotten. And, yeah, what's this, 24 Becker? No idea what this is. So I Google search and I write 24 Becker, and it comes back with this, do you mean 24 Bauer? I said, yes.
Bauer.
And bang, straight into it. And the second series of 24 went to air on the 29th of October, exactly, contemporaneously with all these developments in 2002. And was being broadcast directly into Guantanamo.
And it starts with Kiefer Sutherland torturing somebody.
The second series begins. Well, I then went out. I went out with my then 12-year-old son to buy 24, and we went to the local HMV store and got it. And he was very excited. And we put it in and put in the first. You know how it works. It's 24 hours. So put in the first hour. What would have been broadcast down into Guantanamo on the 29th of October 2002, and it's this guy being terribly abused and spilling all the beans.
And for the greater good.
Yeah, spilling all the beans.
Because Kiefer Sutherland is a good guy. He's a sort of Rambo character.
Actually, there was a very funny moment because of course, I had no real idea who Kiefer Sutherland actually was, although his dad, it turns out, I didn't realise he was the son of the great Donald Sutherland.
Where have you been?
I know. I go to the movies a lot, but I'm very good at putting two and two together. Vanity Fair magazine were very kind in exerting the book a month before it came out. And so it came out in New York on the 2nd of April of this year. And they flew me over to do sort of 3 or 4 days of media about it. And it was very exciting to go to the Vanity Fair office. And it's very, you know, and you realise, you learn the power of a magazine like Vanity Fair, because I don't believe it's the book that has caused hearings to be held. It is the fact that Graydon Carter and his colleagues are basically putting on the cover of Vanity Fair, war crimes were committed by the White House. I mean, that is, in the American context, a big gap that has been crossed, a big step to take in US popular culture. The second day that I was there, another thing I have to own up is I'm a big Arsenal fan, and there was a Champions League game that I was not going to miss, and so we go to the bar opposite the Vanity Fair building, and it was sort of April the third or something. I can't even remember what match it was. But there was a moment when Cesc Fabregas took a corner, and as the corner came over, someone came out to header it, and at that very moment, someone walked in front of me, stopped, and watched Arsenal score a goal. It was very exciting, but I was a bit unhappy because this person had stood in front of me. The person then carries on and leaves the bar, and the person from the Vanity Fair magazine said, "Do you know who that was?" That was Kiefer Sutherland. And it was one of those sort of amazing, life is very strange.
And you were just about to beat him up.
And, well, I wish I'd known. I wish he'd told me before, and I would have sort of gone and grabbed him and had a natter with him about it. Because I think he has a certain amount of angst about what he's done.
It was an amazing series because it was revolutionary in its format and in its production, and it invented a whole new way of storytelling. So it was a tremendous piece of drama, but the content was sinister, which I probably wouldn't have figured out until I heard you on Start the Week talking about it, and then I sort of thought about it a bit more when I read what you wrote about it.
And then when you begin to look at who watches 24 and who likes it, so Michael Chertoff, the head of Homeland Security, who before was in the Justice Department, head of the Criminal Justice Enforcement Division.
And it's made by Fox.
Made by Fox. Clarence Thomas went to the Supreme Court judge, went to a 24 Congress with his wife. So you begin to get a sense. What's a 24 Congress? Well, it's like, I wouldn't want to go to the 24 Congress. I've always wanted to go to the Big Lebowski Congress. One of my favorite, just to prove to you I do go to the movies. But they have every year. Yeah, no, it exists. People gather. Thousands of people gather in California. Then they go dressed up as the dude and other people, and they just hang out and they talk about the Big Lebowski, and people do that for 24 also. And so that's the wonderful thing about America, because we have to say what's great about America. And what's great about America is that I'd never have got this information out of people in Britain. Okay? In America, it's an astonishingly open society.
But you were very much helped by the fact that you weren't a journalist, you were a lawyer. Yeah. And that, in a way, gives your book a very different character from a book that would have been written by a journalist. And one question I really want to ask you is, as a lawyer, when Abu Ghraib came out, there was endless denial from the authorities that they knew this was just these terrible people who were in the jail and so on. And then I know from my own researches that various countries in Europe have given themselves, changed their laws so that they can prosecute people for war crimes, a la Pinochet, a la Ariel Sharon at some point was going to be prosecuted in Belgium for the Sabra and Shatila massacres. Then there was this idea in Germany that they were going to prosecute Rumsfeld for torture, for breaching international treaties on torture and so on. And it sort of came to not very much because the prosecutor threw it out and so on. Then they said, well, if the Germans won't do it, the Spanish will do it. And if the Spanish won't do it, the Portuguese will do it. Well, it all sounded like it was kind of pie in the sky. So you got access to these people because you were a lawyer, not a journalist.
And a Brit.
And a Brit.
The accent really helps, it turns out.
Well, yeah, I enjoy the accent myself, but it didn't give me the access that it gave you as a lawyer. The lawyer, I think, is key. But as a lawyer, do you believe that, because people were saying to us that Rumsfeld doesn't go to Europe because he could be arrested. If Rumsfeld sets foot in European territory, the Germans were telling me, we're going to arrest him straight away. Well, I mean, is there a smoking gun? You said that it came from top down. Is there absolutely cast iron evidence that it did come from top down?
No, I think it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear. No one has really challenged the substance of the story, and what it has done is it has exposed the some individuals, I think the individuals at the top, not the individuals at the bottom, to the risk of foreign investigation or foreign prosecution.
Who?
I mean, it goes right to the top. It goes, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Bush, but I've focused on the next tier down. I, for various reasons, was particularly interested in the lawyers. It would have been very easy just to focus on Rumsfeld, Cheney, Bush. they would have had an apparatus that helped them, and I was interested in knowing how the next tier down had been involved. And because I have a legal background, and because I know America's commitment to the rule of law, I was sort of couldn't understand how it was the lawyers had signed off on it. I'd also been very interested. One of the catalysts for writing this book was yet another film that I'd seen. You've now picked out that even if I don't know what 24 is, I do go to the movies a lot and I watch movies. And there's one great movie that some of you will know called Judgment at Nuremberg. Mm. You are my man. I mean, you love the movies that I love. You're there reacting incredibly positively. So Judgment at Nuremberg, 1961, written by Abby Mann, New Yorker, stage play, Broadway, big hit, tells the story of a group of German lawyers prosecuted by a US military tribunal. Spencer Tracy's the judge, Marlene Dietrich, Montgomery Clift, fantastic, wins Oscars, everything. Turns out it's based on a real trial. It's based on the case of United States versus Joseph Altstetter and 15 others, high-ranking Nazi lawyers, of whom the US military, ironically, decided they would make an example, applying the principle that lawyers are gatekeepers to legality and constitutional decision-making. The US military, led by a man who was a chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, Telford Taylor, who went on to become a very, very famous constitutional lawyer in Columbia Law School, created the theory that the person who provides the legal dagger, the lawyer, it can be criminalized for aiding and abetting and being complicit in mass violations of international criminal laws. And so my interest was in part to understand not whether there was a direct comparison between then and now. I think that is fatuous and ridiculous, as a number of people put to me, and with point with which I agree, but to understand the principle. What does a lawyer have to do to cross the line? At what point does giving legal advice cross the line into being bad legal advice, and then cross another line into being unethical legal advice, and then cross another line into being criminal legal advice? And my conclusion, on the basis of all of the people that I spoke with, including, as you'll know, an anonymized European judge and prosecutor with experience in prosecuting these kinds of cases, was that these people are at real risk if they travel outside of the United States. And in fact, I've had recently confirmation.
And they'd be prosecuted for what? For war crimes?
For, well, they could be prosecuted for a number of things, but they could be prosecuted for complicity or participation in torture under the 1984 Torture Convention, which is a universal jurisdiction crime. Anyone who's committed torture or who has aided and abetted or been complicit or participated in torture is liable to criminal investigation anywhere in the world. There's no refuge for that person. Or violations of various provisions of the Geneva Conventions, in particular Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. And the Bush administration has recognized the difficulty it faces. I mean, the story, we've given a simplified version of the story. It's still complicated, but it's not that complicated. In June 2006, the Supreme Court overturned the Bush administration's decision on the Geneva Conventions. It basically said they got it wrong. Geneva applied at Guantanamo. Panic and pandemonium in the administration, because they realize that everything they've been doing for the last 3 years now is a war crime. Mm-hmm. So 3 months later, they passed through Congress the Military Commissions Act, which creates an immunity for any person involved in these interrogations.
Retrospectively?
From September 11th, 2001 to the end of 2005.
Yeah, but it creates that immunity retrospectively.
Only in the US. Mm. Not outside the United States. And as the European judge and the European prosecutor put it to me, that was a very stupid thing to do, because by creating an immunity domestically, you remove the hurdle to foreigners investigating. Foreigners, judges and prosecutors won't investigate unless they're satisfied there's going to be no investigation or prosecution in the place where the crime took place. That's not going to happen now in the United States.
So it gives a green light to investigate elsewhere?
Absolutely. It's a very stupid thing to have done. Mm.
So do you think they will be investigated? Will eventually, I mean, it'll take a while for all this to roll out. And, you know, in the film I made, the Drumheller, who was the head of the CIA in Europe, said, oh, this is all going to come out. It's going to take a little while, but slowly it'll unfold. There will be cases, there will be inquiries, there'll be court cases and so on. Do you think eventually some of the people responsible will be brought to justice, stand trial?
Who knows? But what is clear, to give you one figure, Senator Pinochet was arrested 35 years after his worst crimes were committed. These things don't happen. They couldn't happen in Chile while Pinochet was in office. They couldn't even happen in Chile in the short period after he left office. It just takes time, I think, for societies, for communities, for the rest of the world to begin to be able to act on these issues. There's no period of limitations on international crimes of this kind. For the rest of their natural lives, the people who know who they are and who put in place this deplorable, un-American set of techniques are at risk of foreign investigation, and they are already cutting back on their travels.
Yeah, do they not travel? I mean, Rumsfeld, has he stopped? Because I remember that he did travel. He went to a conference, and there was talk of him exiting by the back exit and leaving a little early because he was frightened of arrest. I mean, but is that real?
I was in the States last week, and someone told me that they had met one of the members of the torture team that I described, one of the members of the torture team's best friend, who told him that this person no longer travels outside of the United States. And this person has now left government service, works for a large corporation. And
for fear of prosecution, for fear of arrest?
Yeah.
But who's going to arrest him?
Well, the way that it works is that any prosecutor anywhere in the world has jurisdiction to arrest. So it's not going to be, you know, a British director of public prosecutions or some such person. It'll be like Pinochet. If it happens, it will be some
Which
way
country
out.
is the most committed to doing that? If you travel to Europe,
I mean,
for example?
it's not. That's the thing. It's not countries. In different countries' legal systems, the exercise of prosecutorial discretion is not controlled by the state. So it's going to turn on who is the individual prosecutor who's keeping tabs on this, and some of them are keeping tabs on this already, who decides to follow a particular person, and when that person sets foot in a country where there is an extradition agreement with the country of the prosecutor, that will go in. That's what happened with Pinochet. Pinochet was arrested in London at the instance of a Spanish prosecutor's indictment, completely unexpectedly, in circumstances that were not predictable in October 1998. It is, incidentally, the 10th anniversary of Senator Pinochet's arrest in about a month's time. And that was a big moment for all of this. I mean, you know, the wheels of criminal justice turn very, very slowly, and I don't think people in this room should be getting excited that there are about to be sort of imminent mass indictments of leading American Bush administration officials. That is not going to happen, and there are probably very good reasons why it shouldn't happen. But there is an issue of responsibility, there is an issue of accountability, and when I've testified before Congress, on each occasion I've been asked, 3 occasions, what should happen, and on each occasion I've given the same answer. I think it's for the United States to get its own house in order. And it's for the United States to carry out a proper investigation of what happened, identify what happened. There are numerous ways of doing that. It can be a commission of inquiry, it can be truth and reconciliation.
But there are congressional inquiries. They've been ongoing for some time, but we don't hear much.
Just a few months. They've only been going on for, I mean, the first one was on May the 10th. It's just started. And there's a presidential election, and I think a lot will turn on who is elected president.
One final word before we ask questions is the prisoner. You trace the story of this one prisoner, prisoner 063, who is being subjected to all these techniques. And, well, what's happened to him?
He is a Saudi Arabian national in his early 20s.
Was he the 20th hijacker?
Well, here's the information that is said to exist about him. I mean, I've not been able to verify it, but it seems as though that they've got some information on him. you can read about it in the 9/11 Commission report because he figures very large in that. He apparently sought to gain access to the United States in August 2001 at Orlando International Airport. At the very moment that he sought to gain access, there was apparently, I've not seen it, video footage of Mohammed Atta in the arrivals lounge at that same airport, waiting to meet someone at the airport. Al-Qahtani did not gain access to the United States. He only, I think, had a one-way ticket. He had very little cash on him. The immigration people didn't believe his story about why he was coming, you know, second-hand car dealer or something like that. And so he's thrown out of the country. A few months later, he's apprehended in Afghanistan, November 2001. He's then transported to Guantanamo in late January 2002. And in June 2002, they work out the person they've got is the same person who tried to get into Orlando International Airport. That's their story anyway.
On September 11, 2001?
In August 2001. And so that's the story. They then put him through these techniques of interrogation. They announce that they are going to prosecute him for war crimes, for terrorism, for various other international crimes. And that announcement is made in February of this year. In fact, it was the very last thing that I got into the book. It was just when the book was at sort of final page-proof stage. The Pentagon announced Al-Qahtani was going to be prosecuted, along with 5 other people. The book then comes out in April, and in the middle of May, but then there's a lot of publicity in the States about the book and the Vanity Fair piece and what happened in Al-Qahtani's story. And a month after the book comes out, the Pentagon announces the detailed charges for the 6 individuals who are going to be prosecuted before military commissions. And in relation to 5, they set out the very detailed charges, the factual allegations, but the 6th, Al-Qahtani, they've dropped the charges on. We don't know why that is precisely. The scuttlebutt is that it is because he's essentially now unprosecutable because of all the information about what has happened to him. So he remains in detention, and the current position of the administration appears to be that they have the right to hold him until the war on terror, so-called, is over.
It's like the war on drugs, it'll never be over. Yeah.
And the likelihood is at this point that he will be there for the rest of his life.
But it's been thrown out. I mean, the case has been thrown out.
It hasn't been thrown out. They decided not to bring charges. They dropped the charges they said they were going to bring, but they reserved the right to bring them back. But it's... And
to hold him and to detain him until that time.
Yeah, I mean, the first person has just gone through these proceedings, which are really not ideal proceedings, as a sort of generous barristerial way of putting it. Salim Hamdan, who was alleged to be Osama bin Laden's driver. The administration wanted 30 years. He was convicted. The administration wanted 30 years. He was sentenced for 5.5 years. He's already been in Guantanamo for 5 years. And so he would come out in normal circumstances in January of this year after the administration, after President Bush has left office. But the administration, I think, has indicated that they reserve their right to hold him even after the 5.5 years has passed. So, you know, there's no end to this, and it's going to land on the laps of President McCain or President Obama. You know, one of them is going to have to sort this out. They've both committed to closing down Guantanamo. They've both committed to stopping the abuse, although McCain has wobbled and is keeping it open in relation to CIA use, which is deeply, deeply troubling. And McCain also voted for the immunity, which is deeply, deeply troubling. But they have both said that they will close it. But there is a real question. You know, what do you do with these people? I mean, I'm not starry-eyed about them. Some of them, I suspect, are problematic, but they are entitled to rights. They are human beings who have rights.
Absolutely.
And there is a real question now as to what is done next after January.
So who has some questions? We have a microphone.
There's never a shortage of questions with this topic. It raises so many fundamentally important
There's somebody
issues.
Up there, yeah. you just want to say your name and who you are.
My name's Elizabeth and I'm Palestinian. And I just have a question in regards to what you're saying about the memo and the effect of it. And so apart from exposing the US government and the CIA to their hypocrisy, so to speak, what effect is this double legal standard where someone who is let off just because of their position, and in some cases like Ariel Sharon, even glorified in their own countries, what effect is this going to have on the integrity of the legal system in the US, but also on a wider perspective on the global scale?
Sure, that's a really important question. I mean, the US legal system has taken time to get up to speed on this. The English legal system has acted very fast. I've done a number of cases in the English courts involving British detainees and indefinite detention, the Labour government's desire to introduce evidence obtained by torture in certain English proceedings. Pause there and think about that for a moment for those of us who were once Labour Party supporters as to what that says about this particular Labour Party today. And the courts, the House of Lords, the Court of Appeal, the High Court, have consistently stepped in and said no. From the earliest date, from November 2002. The US courts were much slower, but they deserve credit, particularly in the Supreme Court. And the Bush administration has lost every case it has fought at the Supreme Court. And so I think it is right, perhaps, to note that it's been slower than it should have been. But I don't think one can, at the end of the day, critique the US legal system for not having delivered the right answers. I mean, I wish the Supreme Court judgments had been unanimous 9-0. They're not. They're very narrow decisions, but they are essentially the right decisions. I think it's not the US legal system that has been undermined so much as the propensity and capacity of the United States to be able to marshal arguments concerning the rule of law, concerning human rights, concerning international laws. Internationally, that has been severely, severely damaged, and I do not rejoice in that in any way, because at the end of the day, there's been no country that has done more to put in place the system of human rights norms that led to the arrest of Senator Pinochet, or that caused international criminal tribunals to be created, even if the United States ultimately didn't join up to them. So there are no doubt many critiques one could make of the United States for many things. But one thing the United States has done more than any other country is to lead the world in putting in place a system of international human rights laws. Perhaps they don't want them applied to themselves. That's a different issue. And it's not clear to me, without the United States, who's going to bat for those rules. It's not going to be the European community. It's not going to be the Russians. It's not going to be the Chinese. And so I think we all actually have a pretty big interest in getting the United States to sort this out pretty quickly.
Why not the European community?
They just don't have the clout. They don't have the clout of the Americans, and the European community is deeply divided on.
Why? I mean, to what degree is the fact that judges are political appointments in the United States, does it lend the system to a degree of abuse that you outline in your book? For example, Dunleavy, who is a judge and who is recruited to go and supervise the introduction of these techniques in Guantanamo. We in Britain believe that our judges are above politics or outside of politics. That may or may not be true, but certainly it bears no comparison to the way it is in the United States.
Well, I mean, you know, each country has its own way of appointing judges, and I think at the end of the day it sort of swings and roundabouts as to which legal system produces a better system of justice.
It's a highly political sponsorship in the United States.
Yeah, but is it any less political in this country in terms of how people become judges? It's all now beginning to change. But, you know, to say that it's not political in Britain who becomes a judge is obviously not correct. I mean, let's look at who the swing judge was in the Supreme Court. He was appointed, Anthony Kennedy, by a Republican president, you know, and in the end he did the right thing, in my view. And Alberto Mora did the right thing, a deep Republican, Cuban-American, an extraordinarily wonderful man. In a sense, these are not party political issues. Many of the people, it took a Republican general counsel of the Navy to stop this from happening at the very same time that a Labour government was pushing for the introduction of evidence obtained by torture in the English courts. So these things are really, in a way, don't lend themselves to simple left, right, good, bad. It turns out it's a lot more complicated. And I think the same goes for the judges.
Who else had a question? What about you?
I'm interested in the moral arguments that persuade the lawyers and the people involved in the book. And I know that you mention that many of the senior military people are not, don't believe the idea of the moral argument of the ticking bomb. And I was wondering if you could be specific about who on the ground felt and used that. Who did you interview that really had that in the forefront of their mind?
Well, both Diane Beaver and Mike Dunleavy genuinely believed, even at the time that I interviewed them, that they had done the right thing. That they faced a situation in which they were being told that the intelligence was showing a spiking of threats to the United States, that they had someone who they believed had information, and that in those circumstances what they were doing was not torturing, it was using coercive interrogation to get the information out of that man's head. Now, I fundamentally disagree with their approach to it, but in a curious way, I recognize the integrity of what they thought they were doing. I think it is totally wrong. It may even be criminal. But they plainly believed that they were doing this for the right reasons.
But if you found out that a major attack had been thwarted by such techniques,
I don't think it makes any difference.
Would you have to think again? Well,
No.
exactly, that's the question.
I don't think it makes... I mean, I think... my position is that torture is wrong in all circumstances and can never be justified in law. It may be that a person finds himself or herself in a situation in which he or she will use torture, but he or she has to do that in the knowledge that they face the full weight of the criminal law for doing what they do. So I don't adopt a utilitarian approach in saying it is always wrong and can never be made lawful under any circumstances. But even assuming a different approach, adopting a utilitarian approach, assuming that you could produce useful information in some circumstances that would help protect people, which of course professional interrogators tell you is not the case. Even assuming all of that, applying a utilitarian approach, I think, indicates that it is not a sensible thing to do because there are unintended consequences in terms of what it does to us as a society and to the individuals who are associated with those acts, and also because it plainly acts as a recruiting tool which incites those who challenge us to go even further in their methods and means. And so I think I don't adopt a utilitarian approach, but even if one were to adopt a utilitarian approach, I think the arguments are stacked very heavily against it.
Sorry, just the rest of the staff there, besides the lawyers and would they also use that?
There was a big, big difference of opinion down at Guantanamo. People were very deeply divided. I wouldn't want to leave you with the impression that, you know, everyone wanted to go for coercive interrogation. That was not the case at all. There were many, many people who were very strongly, very strongly opposed. There were very powerful debates down there that were described to me. I met some of the people who supported it. I met some of the people who opposed it. What was critical at the end of the day was the pressure from the top. But for that pressure from the top, it would not have happened. They would have stuck to the rules they had in the US Army Field Manual, and they would not have opened the door to abusive interrogation. It was the pressure from the top that was critical in allowing this to happen, not the debate at the bottom.
There was somebody over there, yeah.
Hi, my name is Andrea. I'm wondering if you could comment further on the actual feasibility of prosecutions within universal jurisdiction. Because you stated that it was up to sort of the initiative of individual prosecutors, though as far as I understand it, this depends on the domestic application of universal jurisdiction. Yeah. So for instance, when the case against Ariel Sharon was progressing in Belgium, Rumsfeld, of course, rang up and threatened the withdrawal of NATO from Brussels. And subsequently, Belgium's law on universal jurisdiction shifted quite heavily in terms of the nationality principle. So I was wondering where, in which other country you would actually see, beyond the initiative of a prosecutor, that this could actually go forward in terms of prosecutions?
I mean, I think there are so many variables. I mean, you know, Rumsfeld is one thing. People below Rumsfeld may well be another thing. With the passage of time, I think people begin to feel differently about it. I think that it really all turns on the propensities of one, as it did in the Pinochet case, on the propensities of one or two independent prosecutors. I mean, I've spoken to some of them. They tell me that on the basis of, I mean, I gave a couple of them all of my materials, and they concluded on the basis of that materials that they were plainly in their jurisdiction grounds for investigation and maybe even of prosecution. Any prosecutor who thinks about bringing a case, you know, weighs up a whole load of factors. One of the factors is what are the prospects of success. You know, in England, if you've got a less than 50% chance of success, you're not going to prosecute. Another factor is whether or not in the scheme of all the different things that need to be done, does it make sense to put limited resources into the prosecution of that particular individual? And I think we can, you know, you're in as good a position as I am to speculate as to the kind of person who would decide that this is important enough with a sufficient prospect of success to do something about it. I mean, at the very least what one can say is the possibility cannot be excluded, and I think it's likely that one can go much further. The evidence is pretty compelling. I mean, what was put in place was a common plan to subvert the international rules that protect and prohibit this kind of thing, and to replace those rules with techniques of interrogation which on their face are incompatible with the Torture Convention and incompatible with the Geneva Conventions. So it's a pretty compelling case. It's not a difficult case to mount. The question is, who do you go against? Do you go against the politicians? Do you go against the lawyers? Do you go against the people who are conducting the interrogations on the ground? In a sense, the easiest thing is to go against the Lindy Englands of the world.
No, but Rumsfeld's the big prize, isn't he? That's the one that everybody wants.
I mean, that may well be right, but from the prosecutor's perspective, you're just weighing up lots of different things. You know, so the US says, well, we've prosecuted the people who did all the stuff at Abu Ghraib, but actually, frankly, is Lindy England the person who's really responsible for what happened? I don't think so. I mean, it goes much, much higher, but a prosecutor has to ask herself what she is going to do. I mean, imagine yourself as a prosecutor. You know, you've got an in tray that is heaving. Is this going to be a priority for you right now? Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but that's the type of internal debate a prosecutor is going to look at. But all the facts and the rules of law are there to permit it to happen if a prosecutor wants to go down that route.
But there is an ongoing case. If you Google prosecuting Rumsfeld, you will see that there is the, is it the ACLU in New York that are working with the Germans to pursue Rumsfeld through a universal jurisdiction process. Yeah. Last time I looked at it, which was a little while ago, the Germans had abandoned it, but they were saying the Spanish were going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a tactical issue. I mean, it's for the prosecutor to decide. Do you go against, you know, the big cheese, or do you just go a little further down to get the ball rolling? I think it's still too close to September the 11th. I think it's still too delicate to really imagine that people are going to look at this. But if you go before, I mean, Congress, 54 members of Congress called for the appointment of a special prosecutor. So, you know, something has changed. Joe Biden, as I mentioned, stumbled into this sort of accidentally a couple of weeks ago and then had to sort of retreat when he realized the implications of what he was saying. And, you know, the fact that there are opinion pieces in the Wall Street Journal, in the New York Times, editorials in the Wall Street Journal saying prosecutions are the wrong thing, the whole debate has crossed a threshold.
Yes.
Well, you talked about this being... Sorry, wait for the mic.
Do you want to say who you are?
Sorry, Richard, from no organisation at all, but loves the movies you love.
The Big Lebowski.
Yeah, and also Judgment at Nuremberg, one of the best movies ever made.
You can see the only bit you really, well, you see the whole thing, but the only bit you really need to see is the 5-minute verdict. Spencer Tracy, you can get that on YouTube, just type in Spencer Tracy Nuremberg, and you will get one of the great Hollywood speeches of all time.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's worth watching the whole thing, I think. But, okay, you touched on the question of transparency, and you talked about, or I'd almost draw the implication that it's lucky if this was going to happen anywhere, that it happened in the States, because that's where you actually still could get to talk to these people, you could get onto Vanity Fair. That's unlikely to happen in Europe. It's never going to happen in China or the Soviet Union or Iraq or Iran, etc. So it is all about transparency, and where we have had other types of issues like Enron, which led to Sarbanes-Oxley, like the credit crunch, which is going to lead to blowing transparency into all the financial transactions. The issue here is we're looking at transparency behind the army wall. As a lawyer, and with all your dealings in this space, can you see what could be proposed or what could be done to blow greater transparency into that space so this couldn't happen again?
Well, I wouldn't do what Alan Dershowitz would like to do, which is to say, okay, this is going to happen, I'm against it, but let's institutionalize it to make sure that next time it happens, the president has to sign off very publicly and give an explanation. I think that is totally the wrong way to go. I think it's unimaginable that this could happen again in the US military. The US military at the senior levels will not let this happen again. They are as horrified as anyone else in this room. I have had a large number of emails from people I don't know in the US military, one in particular, a serving 4-star Air Force general who wrote an email wrote an email to a friend of mine asking him to pass it on anonymously, saying, I've worked with Haynes and Addington for the last 5 years. Addington is the vice president's lawyer. I've read Sands' book. It accords exactly with my experience of what these people are like. I hope they hang together. I mean, that's a pretty shocking sort of email to get from, I mean, you don't get higher than a 4-star general in the US Air Force. That is a pretty senior position. It's not going to happen again in the US military. It has been cleaned up there. I mean, it may still be going on in relation to the CIA. We don't know what's going on in relation to the CIA, and that, I think, is deeply problematic, and that absolutely has to be stopped. The fact that it is still permitted to go on, the fact that Congress tried to pass legislation prohibiting the CIA from using these very same techniques of interrogation, and the president vetoed that, and it was not able to get sufficient votes in Congress to get an override, I think tells you that in the United States, still today, there is considerable support for the use of these techniques in some circumstances. And that, I think, is very, very troubling. And what the administration has succeeded in doing is opening that door that I have said ought always to be kept closed. They have legitimized the possibility in the minds of many people, perhaps not a majority of people, but enough people, the Democrats don't want to raise this as a big issue in the election, to create the possibility that this system of techniques could be used again. And I think that's very problematic, not least because it undermines the ability of the United States to stop others from doing it around the world. You know, I think there needs to be congressional legislation which says no in any circumstances, and that's only going to come if Obama wins and if the Democrats hold both houses. In those circumstances, I think that is likely to happen, and that will close the door to all of this, and then the cleanup can begin.
When I was making Mystery Flights, I mean, a lot of people claimed they wanted to speak to me, but if they were to speak to me, they would go to jail. They were bound by rules of secrecy, which weren't just their contract of employment, but which were legally binding contracts which would send them to jail, these people in the CIA and so on. And in among those people, some of them talked to me, some of them didn't, were doctors who had clearly abused their brief and their ethical code as doctors in the administration of drugs, which were done in a humiliating way, in renditions, in kidnaps, and so on of people. These people continue to be protected. They're protected not so much by the law, but by the fact that no journalist will, can get at them, because they're protected by the way they live and the way they work, and by the mechanisms around them, but also by the fact that, you know, even if they want to talk to you, they can't, because they'll be punished further, they'll lose their pensions. I mean, all that is in place, and are these stories going to come out?
I think they will come out. Yeah, I think after the Bush administration's gone, a great deal more is going to come out, and I think a great deal more will come out in terms of the involvement of other states. And I think we need to be very clear that we can't pat ourselves on the back, because my great fear is that much will come out about British and other countries' complicities, not as though our esteemed former Prime Minister was, you know, reading Bush the Riot Act and telling him that he's got to get this right. I mean, we know that that wasn't going on. And I think that the great fear is that much will come out, and that, you know, it has to come out. And when it comes out, it will perhaps show that the Americans were not entirely on their own in relation to the subjects you've covered in your film, and that we all need to interrogate ourselves about how it could be that Britain could in some way have been complicit. I mean, there's a case going through the courts right now. I can't say very much about it because I'm involved in it. You know, we have a tradition, a very sensible tradition, that when you're counseling a case, you don't talk about it, but follow the case of Binyam Mohammed, which is publicly being reported about the role of the United Kingdom, allegedly. Read, if you're interested in this, read the judgments that have been given and form your own view as to what, if any, role the United Kingdom has had in some of these stories.
And the evasive answers from Jack Straw when he was being quizzed by the Select Committee.
I mean, it's very, very troublesome. Very, very troublesome.
More questions? Yeah.
Ewan Macmillan, Medical Justice. I think one of the more interesting aspects of what you call force creep in your book is not so much that the BIBU memo succeeded in redefining torture, but that it created the impression that there was no widely accepted definition of torture. And this is something I've noticed in conversation with very, very senior civil servants in this country. But there's in one respect, when you summarize the BIBU memo at the beginning of your presentation, you referred to the physical application of it, to the fact that pain had to be equivalent to organ failure or death. Of course, there is the other, more liberal aspect of the BIBU memo, which refers to post-traumatic stress disorder. And in this respect, I mean, or other long-term effects of treatment. And the memo says that if the interrogation techniques fall short of creating some long-term psychological effect equivalent to PTSD, then it's not torture. In this respect, the BIBU memo, of course, is considerably sets the bar rather lower than our own asylum courts, for instance, do at the present, where even the Court of Appeal regularly sets aside expert testimony on the effects of PTSD. I have a question about rendition, scarring, and Guantanamo. And obviously we don't want to look too closely at the whole matter of Binyam Mohammed, but in talking to the ACLU about this case, I understood that the standard of medical evidence of physical torture, of scarring, so elicited in the Binyam Mohammed case, and no doubt in other rendition cases, is actually quite low still. Because of the shift in British asylum courts, and indeed in France as well, away from the issues of psychological torture to evidence of physical torture, doctors working in the field have developed increasingly sophisticated techniques to respond to ministries' assertions that there is no evidence of torture. So, for instance, if a ministry alleges that that the doctor has been unduly influenced by his patient's accounts of how these scars were sustained. Doctors have ways of responding to this by looking at assemblages of scars. So the game on the interpretation of scarring is constantly rising. When I talk to the ACLU lawyers about rendition and about these increasingly sophisticated approach to the assessment of scars, and of course the response of torturers who very often seek to avoid scars, the issue of the responsibility of acts of violence committed in different jurisdictions came up. So, for instance...
Why don't I come in on that, because yes. I know that there's a couple of other people who want to ask questions before we finish, which is quite soon. I mean, I was acutely conscious that as a lawyer, I was not equipped to easily form a view on whether a threshold of torture had been crossed. I was acutely aware also of the mental side of the suffering. So what I did was I retained the assistance of a clinical psychiatrist who has treated for many years victims of torture who've come from all over the world. She was recommended to me by 2 different people. I gave her the interrogation log of Mohammed al-Qahtani and just said, go away, read it, I'm not going to say anything, I'm just interested to know how you interpret that. You know, the definition of torture in international law is severe mental or physical pain or suffering. What do you need to know to be able to assess whether that threshold has been crossed? And she came back, she was very careful, very diligent, and she said, of course, I can't express a final view or anything like a final view without knowing a lot more, probably without meeting the person, probably without talking to the person. That makes precisely the point that you're making. I mean, it is not easy to work these things out. But what she had done was she had gone through the entire interrogation log. I described this in the book. It was interesting. You know, I looked at all the horrible things they did to him, what I thought were horrible things, but what I didn't do is what she did. She went through with a blue marker the entire interrogation log and looked for what she called expressions of distress that would have been recorded in the interrogation log. And every page had blue markings all over it. And that's what led her to conclude that on the basis of this limited evidence...
What's an expression of distress? Give me an example.
He started crying, he started shouting, he started pulling the intravenous tubes out of him, he was lying on the floor in a fetal position, he was screaming, he tried to hit... I mean, it's just page after page after page of it. Some of you will have seen the book, so you know, it's... The techniques themselves, when you read the list of them, don't look so awful. Okay, you just read them and you think, well, okay, light shoving and poking, what's wrong with that? I mean, you know, it's not allowed in international law, but actually is that torture? Well, on its own, it's not torture, but if light shoving and poking is inflicted on a Muslim male who has been forcibly groomed, shaved, who has dogs next to him, who's having threats made to his family, who is naked, and who has not slept for days on end, has had loud music played to him, has been hospitalized for hypothermia because he's been through intense heat and cold, and then has a semi-clad female straddling him, sticking pictures of naked women all over him. That's what light shoving and poking was. And so everything is contextual, and words on a page mean very little until you know how it has been inflicted. You know, there was a very surreal moment in one of the hearings that I participated in with a man called Doug Feith, who was a central player in my book. He was the number 3 in the Pentagon, Undersecretary of Policy for Defense. One of the techniques that's listed in the memorandum is removal of clothing. During the hearing, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, or the subcommittee, Congressman Nadler, said, well, Mr. Feith, why is nudity humane? He simply interpreted the words removal of clothing as nudity. And Doug Feith just said, removal of clothing isn't nudity, sir. There's a big difference between the two. And so what these people are doing is taking refuge in a set of words on a page that bear no relationship to what actually happened. And so to come to your question, it's a far from perfect answer. Everything has to be contextualized. I think we have a responsibility not to jump at accusations that people have been tortured where they haven't been. I happen to believe, actually, that there has not been systematic torture at Guantanamo, that very few people at Guantanamo have been tortured in an international legal sense. I think there's been systematic torture at Bagram, at Abu Ghraib, and in lots of other places. But I think the allegation that there was systematic torture of all detainees at Guantanamo is not right. And I think the question that you raise at least elicits from me the view that we need to be responsible in how we go about this and exercise a degree of caution in making these types of accusations. But in the case of Mohammed al-Qahtani, as Abigail Seltzer said to me, if you take 12 clinical psychiatrists, put them in a room, give them this interrogation log, they're all going to conclude that this guy was tortured.
We've got room for one more question, and I saw your hand go up.
My name is Metin Başoğlu. I'm a psychiatrist from King's College London. On the issue of mental health effects of torture, this is something that we have actually investigated in a group of torture survivors from former Yugoslavia countries. And we had quite detailed data to look at the differences between physical forms of torture as opposed to non-physical psychological forms of torture. And the data enabled us to look at a wide range of interrogation and captivity stresses, about 44 of them. Only about 10 of them concerned physical torture. And we had subjective distress ratings for each individual form of torture that the survivors had reported. And we also had a long-term outcome assessment, so how many of them developed PTSD in the long term. So based on those two criteria, which is, as you know, figures in the torture definition, the 2004 memorandum, Justice Department memorandum, there was no distinction at all. Whether psychological or physical, all survivors reported similar levels of distress, and both groups reported similar rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in the long term. Now, this study was published last year in a major American psychiatric journal, and there was a wide media coverage about it. The reason why we reported that study was the fact that the 2004 memorandum cited our work to justify the criterion of prolonged mental harm. When I saw my name in the documents, you can imagine how I felt. In fact, they were misinterpreting the data that we had reported about 10 or 15 years ago, actually. And basically saying that, well, the long-term outcome of torture is post-traumatic stress disorder, and they cite my name. And then, of course, then that justifies the criterion of prolonged mental damage. But then our data didn't show that. You see, because about only in that particular study that they cited, we had found 18% of the survivors had developed post-traumatic stress disorder, as opposed to 4% in the control. It was a control study. Yes, I mean, it meant that torture had psychological effects, but it also meant that about 82%, yes, 82% of survivors did not develop PTSD. So what do you make of them?
So what's
does
the
that mean that, does it rule out their experience as torture? I mean, does it disqualify their experience as torture? So it doesn't make sense. Basically, the memorandum, the justification that they forwarded, they used to support their own position, did not make sense. And all that was reported, of course, in that paper. It made a big media impact, and basically, it's the only study that actually provides evidence that psychological forms of torture don't differ from physical torture in terms of their immediate impact as well as their long-term impact. Now, one question here, actually, what I was meaning to ask you is, the data evidence shows that actually there's no distinction between physical torture and so-called cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatments. And that distinction appears in all international law. Sure. In my view, as a mental health professional, I'm not a legal expert here, but in my view, that is the root of the problem, because it is that distinction that is being exploited and abused for this new definition of torture. And it needs to be abolished. My question is, how much does scientific evidence figure in decision makers in international law? What does it take to change that law?
No, that's a really, really important point, and it's plain that the distinction in the 1984 Torture Convention between, on the one hand, torture, and on the other hand, cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment, which is prohibited but not subject to the same constraints or consequences as torture, gave certain people a leeway, shall we say, to think creatively and to misrepresent the law and to misrepresent the views of people like you, and to, insert a little set of arguments that were deeply, deeply pernicious. There's a very good article written by Lord Hope, who is a law lord, on sort of this issue, actually. But basically setting forward, the article is just called Torture, and it's published in a journal called the International Comparative Law Quarterly. And it sort of reaches the conclusion that the distinction has really fallen away in the eyes of many lawyers, in the sense that the moment you use anything forcible to obtain a confession and you are acting in a public capacity, you have crossed the line into torture. And that cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment is intended to refer to that situation in which you are not trying to alter someone's behavior in order to gain information or to get them to do something or not do something, but deals with the situation in prisons and detention centers in many parts of the world where people are being detained but without other purpose. And I think one of the consequences of this very bad story that has emerged in the last few years is that it is causing people to revisit precisely the whole question of definitions and whether that distinction, as currently drafted, is in any way sustainable. And that, I think, is where a lot of people's energies ought now to be going, because I think you're right. I think that the distinction was seized on and was used by people not acting in good faith to justify the unjustifiable.
We have to end it, I'm afraid. Time's run out, but you're going to go downstairs, are you? Be around? People can come and chat to you if they want to ask you something more. Okay, so thank you very much for coming. I hope you found it.
Thank you.